Welcome to a special episode of TrialSite News. Today we'll be discussing the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and their Vaccine and Biological Products Advisory Committee meeting that took place on January 26th. To do this, we have a guest, David Wiseman, a former top research bioscientist at Johnson & Johnson, who now runs his own product research and development business. And to lead this discussion, we have TrialSite News Founder Daniel O'Connor here with us today. So, gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, welcome aboard, Dr. Wiseman. It's an honor and pleasure to have you. I'd like to start this discussion. The FDA had this very important meeting yesterday, and could you sort of summarize for the audience what was the general takeaway from this meeting, and then we'll drill into a couple key parts to discuss.
Okay. Well, the first thing is to understand what did the FDA want to achieve in this meeting, and there were several areas of recognition that they were soliciting the counsel of the Vaccine Advisory Committee. So the first area was that the FDA recognized that there's a bewildering array of different formulations and dose intervals and boosters and primary series, and it's highly confusing. And the FDA recognized that this could and actually is giving rise to vaccination errors. So there was a conscious effort to try and simplify that. And so one of the questions that they asked, a voting question to the panel, was that would they recommend that the primary series, which is currently the original monovalent, Wuhan strain versions of these vaccines, should that be replaced by the bivalent Omicron/Wuhan vaccines that were authorized a few months ago? So that would not only simplify, the number of different kinds of vials that doctors have to deal with, but it would also serve a secondary purpose, and that is, since we're now actually way beyond BA5, BA5 is 0.7% as of today in the CDC nowcast variant list. Should we be going to something that's closer to the current circulating variants? So that was the primary question. There were secondary questions as to what's the process for us making decisions about variant vaccine changes, and should we use a flu vaccine type of model? And it was clear, by the way, and that the FDA and Peter Marks and others said, we know this is not flu. We're not saying it's flu, but we're just wanting to use the flu model and adapt it somehow. So that was another main question, and all the questions that came out of that were, okay, well, how do we make the decision? What do we know about immune correlates to protection? What sorts of data are we going to need? What are the timelines from the drug companies in terms of what their turnaround is? And what they proposed is that there would be a VBRPAC meeting somewhere in May to June of every year. They would look at the circulating variants, and they would make some kind of decisions and recommendations as to what the manufacturers should be making in preparation for a fall vaccination campaign in September. Again, realizing that we don't have seasonality, but they felt that this was the best seasonality that they could get, understanding also that if a new variant of completely different pathogenicity showed up at some time, then they would have additional meetings to deal with it then. So those were the main objectives of the meeting.
A question on that. So if we look at the situation now, that the current bivalent booster product is developed to the spike protein associated with both the wild type plus BA4 and BA5. Those are nearly extinct. There's maybe a couple, to your point, a couple percentage points of infections. Overwhelmingly, these infections are other variants now. And we'll get into the evidence behind that. But the question for you is, given we're in emergency right now, why are we waiting so long? I mean, it seems like there would be an imminent need to plan for the next variant given we are in a public health emergency. So why is it almost feels a little lackadaisical?
It does. I mean, that was the puzzling part, and I was scratching my head. I thought, I mean, they had the briefing document they released a few days ago, and you don't know what's actually going to happen in the meeting. But I thought that the FDA was going to propose, okay, we propose an immediate change to the primary series, going to the current bivalent vaccines. That would have been okay. It's not optimal, but that would have been indicative of some kind of emergency. They didn't even do that. And then to your point, the next thing would have been, okay, let's recommend that the manufacturers make, a new version of vaccine, whether it's XBB, BQ, or whatever it is. They didn't do that either. The only time that really sort of came up in terms of planning was actually from, I think that I recall from Moderna, one of Moderna's slides. They said, look, we've looked at all these different versions of vaccines, BQ and XBB and BA5, and we could make any of these, but there was no impetus from FDA to say, yes, we want you to make this one or that one. Nothing.
Okay, so this leads me to the next question. Implicit in this decision is that the current bivalent BA4, BA5 booster dose, according to the FDA, is completely sufficient to deal with all of these variants that are now in circulation. So the evidence that they provided to declare that the effectiveness is ongoing, robust, and there, did they provide evidence? Because I say this because there's a number of studies now that are questioning the impact and effectiveness of this particular bivalent booster against new variants such as XBB 1.5, what have you. A study from Beth Israel Deaconess in Boston just came out with a study that it doesn't perform very well. So some thoughts. What evidence did they present to show effectiveness, and did they show the other pathway that shows that there's challenges?
Okay, so in the briefing document, again, in the various presentations that were made, the presentations focused generally, I would say, on the idea that bivalent vaccines in general, whether it was the BA1 version, okay, that Pfizer and Moderna were looking at up until June roughly, or the more later BA5 Wuhan versions, they were presenting evidence even from animals or very small clinical studies with maybe a couple of dozen, most of the time, patients. And in the briefing document, FDA were very clear that there were limitations to all of these studies, small studies, non-concurrent controls, of various limitations that they mentioned appropriately, okay, and in different age groups. And so the hodgepodge of information was that the FDA reviewer or lead scientist, Dr. Weir, was saying, well, even though there's a hodgepodge of stuff, the general trend is that these bivalent vaccines work. What they haven't shown is, first of all, there's only limited amount of time that we've had to look at the bivalent vaccine. So to the extent there is any efficacy data, there is a little bit from the CDC. It's only been 2 months, 3 months. So we can't look at waning. And by now, those BA5 variants are irrelevant. Today's estimate, I just looked up, was 0.7%. So they should be looking at XBB and BQ. Then what they did is they did show some XBB and BQ data from immunological antibody measurement studies, and they're trying to now walk this very big, very thin tightrope and saying, well, we all agree there's no immune correlative protection. Just because we measure this level of antibodies, we can't translate it to this degree of protection, whether it's infection or serious disease or whatever it happens to be, but we're going to continue to use it. There was some discussion from the committee. I think even Dr. Rubin was one of the people. Maybe Dr. Levy was another one. That they acknowledged there are multiple mechanisms going on. We're talking about Novavax versus mRNA. So different mechanisms and different age groups, the correlates are going to be different. So they understand that there's a tremendous problem. In fact, Dr. Weir from FDA said, if you think it was complicated before, it's even more complicated now. So they've recognized that we can't just measure antibody levels because we don't know what that means, but we're going to do it anyway. So the evidence that you asked me is extremely poor. And bottom line, they missed a few studies. It's in the briefing document. You'll probably post it on the website. But there's a couple of studies that they missed completely. One of them had a title something like "Alarming Reduction in or Escape Effect," or the word "alarming" was in the title. Okay, and they missed those entirely. They didn't present those to the committee. So I don't know what the committee thought. They just said, okay, yeah, it's a good idea to have new variants. It's a good idea to simplify it. And that was it. I think FDA are just going to go away and just, okay, they're going to make a decision and that's it.
Just so we're clear for the audience, Dr. Wiseman, is what you're implying is that the FDA is picking and choosing which studies to include in these meetings to make their decisions.
Well, at least to inform the committee members, and this is not the first time we've seen this. I've documented it. I think in an article in TrialSite News a couple of times when you and I first started talking a year and a half ago. You were the first person, I think, to publish that we documented that they've left out key studies when they're presenting data to the committee to allow them to inform their decisions. But the whole tone of the meeting was completely puzzling. If there's an emergency, like to your first question, Daniel, if there's an emergency, then let's make the changes now. Why aren't you?
I agree with you. So it's problematic what you're bringing up. We've got a situation where we're in a declared emergency, yet we have a lackadaisical long-term process now to figure out what the optimal process is to head towards an annual SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. Number one. Number two, we don't have sufficient evidence presented. We have partial evidence. We seem to have subjective biased behavior among our regulators. Okay, that's a concern. That's definitely a concern. Now I want to get into another topic, which is safety. Our line at TrialSite is, even, safe and effective, even at a rate of 0.002, with 225, now it's about 229 million primary series vaccinations. Even at that small number, you're talking about, about 500,000 vaccine injured that has not been adequately planned for. But let's talk about this recent stroke data. What was, sort of discussed in the meeting, and what do they plan on doing about this potential signal, and what are the implications of any actions moving forward?
Okay, so as you pointed out, in the last week or so, there's been reports of ischemic stroke associated mainly, I think, with the Pfizer vaccine. I think with the bivalent vaccine, and this was discussed at the meeting. And what the two main presenters on the topic were the CDC's Dr. Tom Shimabukuro and FDA's Dr. Richard Fauci, and Dr. Klein from Kaiser Permanente. And what they showed was that in one of the methods of surveillance that they had, a signal. I mean, again, to clarify, a signal does not mean causation. It means there's something that we need to look at more closely. That's what a signal means. So let's be clear about that. So a signal showed up for ischemic stroke in, I believe it was the VSD, Vaccine Safety Data Link system, that suggested there was a higher incidence of ischemic stroke in people over 65 years old. Okay, very good. They went and looked at that, and they did some, looking and closer examination, and what they seem to be indicating at this moment is that is it a fact that the ischemic stroke is going up in this group, or it's just going down in the control group? Okay, I'm not going to get into what the control group is because that's hugely complicated. But they concluded it was sort of a bit of both. And not only that, they concluded that it looks like there's an association of this signal with people who are taking the flu vaccine at the same time, concomitant administration. And so what they've concluded is that they don't believe that this signal is real at the moment. They believe that they are still going to monitor it, looking at it closely. They looked at other databases and other systems they had. They consulted, the various international regulatory agencies that they speak with regularly. None of those people could find it in their signal methodologies. And they've concluded that, okay, there's no reason to change the guidelines at this point. We recommend, people should be vaccinated and so on and so forth without any regard to this particular signal. Now, 2 points emerged. First of all, there was extensive back and forth between Dr. Shimabukuro and Dr. Forshi in response particularly to a question from Dr. Rubin on the committee, the chairman of the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, who pointed out that the data are contradictory. He was happy to see them point this out. That's good discussion. And what should the message be, asks Dr. Rubin, to the public who are watching this? And the message should be, yes, we've looked at it. We can continue to look at it. Things may come up, but we're going to continue to look at keep business as usual. What I did a short while ago is I looked at 2 other places that anyone can do. And I looked for the signal for a potential signal for ischemic stroke. And one of them is in the VAERS, it was in the FOIA request disclosure that was released very recently to do with something called one of the signaling methodologies called PRR. Okay, and I looked in there, and sure enough, as of July, there was a signal, right, for ischemic stroke for mRNA vaccines in general. That's in CDC's own numbers. There's a second place where you can go and look online. It's a website that is part of a work that was sponsored by NIH, where you can plug in the name of the vaccine, the name of the adverse event, and sure enough, there's a signal there in that system. That's NIH. Now they do manipulate what they call a signal. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but in 2 other places, right? In FDA, in CDC, and an NIH database, if you will, okay, there are signals for ischemic stroke. That's a huge problem because they've just said, oh, we only found it in one place. We couldn't find it anywhere else. Business as usual. Okay.
So, Dr. Wiseman, at a high level, when you looked into these other repositories, what did you see that made you come to the conclusion that there's a signal? Was it a number of cases?
Yeah, it's a number. It's a certain calculation, and if it meets this number and that number and so on, I can show it to you. But just to be brief, if it meets certain numerical values, okay, then that's called a signal. Okay.
So what we have here is some data point that there could be a risk of this type of stroke in elderly that have received the bivalent booster plus the flu shot.
Well, but just to be clear, Daniel, in the 2 databases I mentioned, they don't discuss whether there was flu or not flu. It's just it's not
general. Okay,
it doesn't deal with that. Yeah.
The reason that's relevant is, remember, with definitely imperfect data, a few months ago, the White House had a briefing. And the COVID coordinator, Dr. Jha, I believe is his last name, for the Biden administration, went out on a limb there, I guess, so to speak, and said, that's why God gave us 2 arms, one for the COVID shot and one for the flu shot. So a lot of elderly folks listen to that, okay? That's not a medical, that's not a formal place to get medical advice, but they listen to that. They go and get their flu shot along with their COVID booster. And it's a very sensitive topic because the government was telling people to go do this. Okay. So, we need to take this very seriously. Now, I believe there was mention that they were going to study this matter prospectively.
Right. So one of the follow-up items that they mentioned is that we're going to continue to study this, and we're going to look at whether they got the flu the same day, they didn't get the flu the same day, the various things. And one of the members of the committee, Dr. Chatterjee, asked, could you explain what that is, what that study is, and will you be getting informed consent from the people who you are going to be studying? And the answer back was, no, we're not, because this is a passive study we are not actively, randomizing people to treatment. It's just whoever shows up in whichever systems they are going to be monitoring in this type of study design, those people will be effectively in the study. Okay, so yes, they're not randomizing people, but nonetheless, people based on the sort of advice that you've just mentioned a moment ago are going to be, and the don't worry about this statement essentially are going to be taking their flu vaccine and with the COVID vaccine, and it may be nothing. Let's be clear about that. It may be nothing, but if you have a suspicion sufficient for you to say we need to study this, you need to be telling people that whether they're in a study or not. Okay, you need to be disclosing what your suspicions are, and certainly there is a suspicion here. Whether it pans out in the end, we have no idea. Okay, but the signals are more than one database, as I've just told you. And people need to know that there's a suspicion here, and they can make up their own mind. If they want to take the risk, that's fine. But they need to be told that.
So along those lines, typically with an observational study, typically they look at folks that are going through the clinic anyway. They're getting their vaccines, they're getting other procedures. That data gets recorded in an electronic health record, real world data, and then they'll set up protocol design for the study. And typically in their mind, no, we don't need informed consent because this is a real world situation. Okay. But the challenge is if you're aware of a potential signal, and to your point, Dr. Wiseman, there may not be, actually, we don't know for sure. But ethically, if you suspect that there may be a signal, that there may be something behind that signal that you picked up at one point, and that there's elderly going and getting their COVID shot, booster, and a flu shot at the same time, probably it's a good practice to inform them.
At least a good practice, if not much higher level than it's a nice thing to do. I mean, they're talking all the time. Oh, we want to be transparent and we want to be open. We want to increase trust in the government. This does not increase trust in the government whatsoever. And by the way, this is not the first instance of this that we've seen. We've seen it over a year and a half ago in relation to pregnancy. Okay, and CDC had 2 studies ongoing. The documentation, which I've got documented, it's been in various submissions that I've made to either CDC or FDA. So I've documented where this is actually recorded. Once the vaccines were authorized, CDC says, well, now it's been authorized and it could, and pregnancy is not a contraindication. There is an urgent need. They use the term, there is an urgent need to study the vaccines in pregnancy. Okay. But we're going to ask for a waiver for informed consent when in this study protocol. Well, if you think there's an urgent need to study this in pregnancy, why are you strongly recommending, okay, that patients use this in pregnancy? Okay, you have to inform them, yes, we think it's safe, but it's not contraindicated. The studies haven't yet done properly, and there's an urgent need. Plus, Daniel, there were mandates. And people lost their jobs because or took their vaccine being pregnant and under those conditions.
That's right. And driving all of that was a public health emergency. And that this pathogen that had a death rate during Delta of about 1.3%, maybe a little bit higher up front, maybe as high as 3 or 4%, went down to 1.5%. Now it's down to, according to one study at Cleveland Clinic, at about 0.4%. So it's a little bit higher than flu. Okay, but it's still, so the premise behind all of this was that this is an incredibly dangerous virus, and that you had to do extraordinary measures. You had to go to extraordinary measures to protect people. And remember, in fairness to the government, if you look at the American population, obesity is about 40% of the population, 25 or so percent of the children in this country. And obesity is a comorbidity. It's a risk factor. So, you're in a government role. They're looking at the risk of morbidity or mortality. And they're looking at the population as a whole. They don't have time to slice and dice, so they just say, just get it. The challenge is be transparent along the way.
Right.
I think that's what we're trying to do. So look, Dr. Wiseman, we want to do more of these. We're grateful. You've been doing this on your own time for quite a while. We want to start doing more of these when we can. Our goal is to, help government help itself get more credibility and trust again. That's what we need in society.
And just to just follow on the point that you were making, part of the discussion document, and this was, I think, a welcome breeze of fresh air for me, at least, was that they were saying, okay, well, what is going to be our policy going forward? What sort of vaccination schedule are we going to be recommending, or the CDC is going to be recommending going forward? And the tone was, well, we do have to sort of stratify this by risk meaning age, comorbidities, and that type of thing. So they recognized that. The other part that they recognized, I think, significantly, although it wasn't discussed extensively at the meeting, was the role of natural immunity. And so they're basically saying, well, it might be the case if someone's already had a COVID infection at some point, okay, and they didn't really discuss a year ago, 6 months ago, that would basically be sufficient, maybe with one vaccination shot rather than 2 or 3. So I think I use the term exit ramp. That maybe the FDA are trying to say, okay, let's tone this down a bit. Mandates aren't particularly popular. We've only got 15% of the population taking these boosters. We've got to do something to sort of tone this down and to recognize some of the legitimate discussion points that have been floating around for the last 2 years, and that was in the document. So I certainly welcome that, and I hope that gets implemented. We'll see what the CDC does with this. They're going to have a meeting in February. Presumably they're going to be sort of having a follow-up version of this meeting, and let's see what the FDA actually do in the next few days, few weeks. Are they going to change everything to bivalent? What are they going to do? Let's see. But they need to be transparent. This ischemic stroke thing is huge. There are 2 other databases where this is showing up. You need to address that, FDA and CDC.
Well, I would conclude that, Dr. Wiseman, we're going to invite you back after CDC meeting if you have the time and inclination. And obviously in future CDC meetings, we're going to start drilling into this more carefully and make sure that we hold people accountable that need to be accountable. I want to thank you so much for taking the time, Dr. Weissman.
And thank you for all your work, Daniel. Thank you very much.